Christopher Hogwood and Gustav Leonhardt discuss some of the wider implications of points raised by previous speakers. The program begins with Gustav Leonhardt playing music by Frescobaldi.
For the final program in this series, we're no longer in a studio, but in the music room of Gustav Leonhardt in Amsterdam. The background includes the ticking, the very apt 18th century clock. The room is full of modern copies of original keyboard instruments, and in fact, the instrument on which the examples are played for this program is a dulcian, copied by Skowronek. The performance of the Frescobaldi toccata that has opened the program is also a very good link into the very vexed question of good taste, le bon goût, which has been quoted by so many people as an easy outlet from problems of stylistic performance in the last few weeks. I think probably Frescobaldi is a very good starting point in that we have a large corpus of music from him and very few rules. And I think you'd agree that the rules we have are enigmatic and often badly translated.
Yes, you're quite right. Well, the bon goût in Frescobaldi is more difficult to determine than perhaps of any other composer, regardless of his introduction to the player of the book of toccatas. And these rules for, well, no, actually rules is too strong a word, the indications of how to play his pieces are extremely important, but still they leave such a variety of possibilities open that one is really at a loss. What is it really the bon goût which I have hit in playing his music? How would he have reacted if he had been present? And I'm very uncertain after and before having played, but perhaps not during playing, because if one is uncertain during the playing, one rather should not play at all. Better do something wrong with great conviction than something which might be good but is so feeble that it doesn't make any impression.
Does this imply that, therefore, having assimilated the rules or made one's possible interpretation of them, you should then forget them when you actually play?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the basic point of all our studies, that are done by people recently who think that going as close as one can to the imagination of the composer, what he had in mind when he composed, is the best thing for a composition. But indeed, when we play, we should forget about everything. When one can forget, one must have things to forget. And these should add up and interlink each other, and one explains the other, and so forth. Now, if I may go back to some details of Frescobaldi, the first statement already is that the beginnings of toccata should be played slowly and arpeggiando. That's very nice to know, but what is slowly? How slow is it? Does it, to which note value does it apply? And how long is the beginning of a toccata that should be played slowly? And when then we assume that this might be the beginning which should be played slowly, how do we proceed? Do we change tempo abruptly or not? Or do we gradually move away from this slow playing? And I believe, but I can't prove it, that his notation is so exact in detail that he probably means that you should not drastically change the tempo, but only gradual. Because if he wanted all of a sudden something twice as fast, then he could have written it. Here, for instance, to take an example, in the second toccata of the second book, we have, which I hope, is the bon goût as far as slow is concerned from the beginning, a piece that starts like that. And I can imagine that this is the introduction, because then he starts moving away from the key. Something like that. And suddenly there is much more interesting detail in the melodic sense. And the writing just before that was semiquavers and now demi-semiquavers. And he goes on in writing semiquavers. Now, I do not believe that one should play, therefore, it sounds as if he would have written going on with demi-semiquavers, and he doesn't write it. So, if one wants to speed up, I think it should be done gradually, so that the listener still can, in a way, see and understand his notation, and then realize, oh, these are semiquavers, but they are speeding up. Well, that's one example of how vague his valuable informations are, as are really the other points he makes.
Some of the features he does pick out, I suppose, are partly bound up with the toccata form being based on improvisation, as well as being a sectional type of construction.
Oh,
and
oh,
he's keen that you should notice where sections finish. He says when you have
Absolutely.
open
You can
notes,
even close the
then-
work earlier if time is short. And
Yes.
so on. Yes.
So clearly he regarded the sections as being detachable almost, that you could cut a few out if you didn't have time to play them all
Yes, but
in extreme circumstances.
But his greatness, in contrast to contemporaries and pupils, is, I think, in the coherence that these pieces have anyway. So I would be very reluctant to stop in the middle of a piece because time was short, and I would rather play another piece. I think it was more perhaps a politeness, or perhaps to increase sales of people who had to play short pieces. No, you can stop this, so buy this music. But as I said before, they are such an extraordinary unity in all their freedom and bizarreness. It's a miracle, a sign of greatness.
When there are rather more general problems that one could extrapolate from this sort of writing, how far do you think one might spread the experience you get from Frescobaldi onto either other contemporaries, to other instruments, and then to slightly later styles? Thinking, for example, of his instructions on holding up the final note of a trill before a cadence, and how you should broaden the tempo at cadences.
The school he formed, his Italian pupils, but also German pupils like Froberger, for instance, can be assumed to adopt it. And in the case of Froberger, certainly when he was writing later pieces in this Italian style, which is fairly close to his master's. And altogether, it is a musical thing under certain circumstances to close a trill and make a retard and wait and then come only with a final note on the next harmony. So in many other instances, I believe it could be done even if not prescribed. But there are other cases, in later music especially, I think, where a much smoother trill, or a more brilliant one for that matter, might be more appropriate. So I would not say this is an absolute general rule, nor do I think that it should be taken as absolute even within Frescobaldi's works. I mean, it's a rule which was generally done, but how much you do it, that may vary greatly, and sometimes perhaps one would hardly do it, and other times so much that you never would do it again.
But it's important, therefore, to know the routes by which this style has spread, for example, through pupils, through other contemporaries, and, as you say, through Froberger into other countries.
Oh, indeed, yes.
So, in fact, the use of this information is not limited exclusively to Italian music, but to Italian-influenced music.
Oh, I'm sure, yes. And in the case of Frescobaldi, we can establish that, especially in Germany, his influence was huge. I mean, he was considered as the great master of that style up to the end of the 18th century, even early 18th century. He was known and respected, and especially printed music was able to get such a wide knowledge about itself. And then, in addition to that, the foreword, which also probably has helped.
Do you think people then understood his foreword better than we understand now? Because I know Bach owned a copy of Fiori Musicali, for instance, which it has less complications of interpretation. But whether, obviously, when Frescobaldi's music came to England, because John Blow quotes a section anonymously in one of his pieces, whether at the same time as knowing the music as it was written, they would also have known the idiomatic style of performance.
I don't know, but I doubt it, actually. And the most important difference between them, say, Blow or Bach, looking at Frescobaldi, and us now, is that we would like to know and to play in Frescobaldi's vein, and they not. They were not interested. But on the other hand, they were still nearer to that style, so they probably understood it better than we do, but they didn't care to play as Frescobaldi wished. That's best shown in the arrangements they made of earlier music, if they occasionally did.
So one really has sort of three aspects of good taste then that you can limit by period, that the Frescobaldi rules should be reasonably isolated to his own period and contemporaries. Also by nationality and the geographic connections that other people may also follow his style of performance if they are pupils or relatives. But also the element of fashion, that some nations may prefer to do it their own way because it was fashionable. Rather, I suppose, as Burney remarks much later on, that the Italians who came to England soon discovered that the English preferred a slightly less embellished style than other nations, and therefore they restrained themselves in their ornamentation, falling in with the national style and the national fashion, rather than what we would think was the most authentic style of performance.
Well, wanting to be authentic is an entirely modern thing. Yes, I say on purpose wanting to be, because nobody can be authentic, and thank God nobody can ever achieve it. What is authenticity in music? Music cannot be authentic. It's reborn each time. And even a composer playing his own work would probably play it different one time from another. So what is authenticity?
The composer, though, would always have an inbuilt feeling of the bounds within which he was operating.
Oh, yes.
And since we are now so long after the event, do you think it's necessary to have a conscious sense of the boundaries to which one can go, that I am playing a piece of Louis Couperin, therefore I must stay within what I know to be the style of the time and not exceed it, even if I know a later effect might be particularly impressive?
Yes. Oh, you phrased that in a splendid way. I would have said exactly the same, but less eloquently so. No, I quite agree. That's exactly what one needs. One should know the boundaries and be free within them, but one should set the boundaries. Well, again, guessing where they are, but that's not so difficult in general, again, especially as far as national styles are concerned.
As soon as fashion, though, begins to operate and a strong national feeling, I'm sure one of the difficulties that people come up against is that within one codified style you sense two levels, a refined level and a common level. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, writing of a certain ornament, advises you never to use it by saying that it's very vulgar and it's totally spoilt by the fact that everybody uses it everywhere. To be authentic or even to mark out one's boundaries, should one therefore go to his side, feeling that it's vulgar and not to be used, or should one follow his evidence that in fact everybody did use it, although he stood apart from them and disapproved?
You are, of course, thinking of this little grace note filling up a descending third. For instance, if there would be written this. I played now only with the main notes. And if there were written little notes in between, then C.P.E. Bach said you should never play this vulgar way. But he says always a little bit. And that makes quite a difference. One is the French way, he says, which has an außerordentliche Mode, but he calls it hässlich. Personally, I have actually no predilection, but I'm ready, being not a composer myself, to follow other composers' wishes, if one can establish. So, in C.P.E. Bach, I would, of course, follow his rules, and with other composers, try to establish the school they come from and whether they could be arranged into the CPE clan. Might have been kind of a clan, or a school in Germany in that period, which was more tending towards the graceful French playing, in that detail.
Do you think it disturbs our attitude to applying these rules now, the fact that most of the comprehensive tutors on performance, of course, were written by composers, and therefore, as you say, Carl Philipp would have had a rather stronger idea about what was vulgar and what was not vulgar, because he would see it applied to his own music primarily, and to other people's music secondarily.
Yes, but I think it's a good chance that with his tutor we have at last an important book by an important composer, and that's so rarely the case.
Also, it's forward-looking, I think, which is quite rare for that type of evidence.
Yes.
Because a precaution that isn't always applied to a source like Quantz is that he was reflecting a style which had already been assumed from Paris, taken to Berlin with a time lag of several years, and he was then writing in older age, looking back to a style he remembered. I suppose in the same way as Mace, writing Music's Monument, in fact only feels the need to produce a book when the style of performance and the taste is in fact in decline, and therefore he's holding out against the modern style. I suppose in a rather negative way, there's also evidence about contemporary style from people like Thomas Mace, when he says now everything is lost because people play rapid divisions on the violin with a great deal of brilliance. This is dreadful. We can use him in both ways to show that then, at the date of publication, you can play rapid divisions, and that 30 years earlier, when he's looking back, you should restrain yourself from that.
Oh, yes. But then our bon goût, on what it is based, I don't know, in this respect, also comes in, because it is a matter of taste. If Mace disliked it, perhaps even a younger man of the same period would have disliked it as well. And we find evidence, again, later generation, that some people like doing much, and others are always against it. It goes on and on. Each generation has that reaction against something overdone. You find it all the time.
It's also a curious difficulty, isn't it, that most people, and I'm sure the particular Frescobaldi problems that you mentioned about interpreting his rules, most people now are at a disadvantage because the rules then were written to supplement a style of performance that people knew. They were merely sort of aide-memoire. Maybe if one regards the main currents of stylistic taste and instruction and so on as having been done by word of mouth, therefore there's more to be deduced from the music itself than from the instructions that were given.
I quite agree.
Until it comes to those areas that couldn't be notated, and I think the Frescobaldi was probably a good example of the use of rubato or fluctuations of tempo. These two areas, I think the tempo changes and the additional notes are two areas where good taste has to operate more strongly than any other, because they are beyond the powers of notation.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And in Frescobaldi and Froberger's works, Froberger's Italian works, or even the French lamentos that are supposed to be very free, these are completely notated. I think nothing could or should be added, but for a listener they should sound as pieces being played on the spot by somebody who makes the ornaments. I think only then they are convincing. One should not know that it is written so exactly.
particular problems that that piece exemplifies, though, the application of a rubato style through some form of notation, is specifically a keyboard player's problem, I think. Lutenists as well maybe face the same type of freedom in writing. Do you think any of the implications, though, from this style can be applied either to other instruments, or whether one should read from other instruments, like the flute and the violin and their appropriate tutors, facts that you can apply to Baroque music in other forms?
I think both ways the information could go. One may explain something of the other, and as far as we now have met with some rubato playing plus playing which changes the meter in the Vorberger Lamento, for instance, that the former, the rubato playing, with which I understand that the beat actually remains the same, but there's liberty within regular beats, can be applied to most other music of the whole Baroque area. I think it was a general thing. They never, I think, played 4 notes or 3 notes in an equal way. They just hated it. They found it was boring and stiff. So that is a very general thing, which is done as much on the keyboard instrument as on string instrument or wind instrument. However, I think there is much less literature for other than keyboard instruments, which is supposed to use that giving up of a strict meter. There are some examples in early 17th century violin literature, for instance, but on the whole it's typically a keyboard element.
The art of syncopation that was sometimes described as part of the art of devising divisions, of course, is a much more regular. It's
that's
applying
based
an
on
irregular rhythmic pattern in a regular way.
That might rather belong to the rubato area.
Yes.
But that's an interesting point, I think. What we try to do on a keyboard instrument with rubato is make a suggestion that the harpsichord or organ is capable of dynamic change. Because the note held longer, say the first note of a group of 4, will seem louder. If you have this irregular T, makes the first one seem louder. So it's by its length and also by its attack. And this is much easier done by string instruments or wind instruments. The keyboard player should more consciously work on getting a fine rubato in order to achieve a dynamic effect than expressive instrument players who don't have to take so much trouble in a technical way to achieve it. But everything is based on a perception which is dynamic, and I think that's one of the most important things to me of playing early music. That is the variety in dynamic level, in detail. And there, the 17th and 18th century is in great contrast to later periods, where the bon goût, and so what they liked, the ideal, was rather in making a long, even line and not a detailed distinction.
The idea that music notated equally should be played in variant rhythm, unequal, wasn't of course limited just to the French, although we tend to associate it nowadays with French style, I think.
No, certainly not. There's ample evidence of all periods that Italian or style, and in Germany and other countries outside of France, it was done dating back to the 16th century, for instance, Santa Maria in Spain. Very, very clear evidence. But it seems that the French, in the course of the 17th century, perhaps even earlier, but we don't know really much about it, brought into a system and made it perhaps a little pedantic, certainly what one reads about it. And then it seems to be confined to only groups of 2 notes. I have never read about a rubato group of notes in a French writing. So distortion of more than two notes. It seems not to have been liked in France. There are many, many writings of the 17th and 18th century about the French playing inégale, but I must confess that it is far from clear. And even things that you find on almost every page of French music, for instance, 2 and 2 slurred notes, I mean printed or written slurs, is never explained. I must say, I don't know what it means, because the French inégalité goes across the beat, and the fingering 3/4 goes across the beat. So you have, starting on the good beat, and not. Now, whether 2 and 2 slurs, written especially, would indicate an inégalité, but grouped as 2 and 2, as printed, I'm not sure at all what it means. And it could mean a kind of inverted inégalité, a kind of Lombard rhythm, but then for instance, in Couperin's first 2 books, he has a special notation for that, and also the 2 and 2 slurred ones. And furthermore, is perhaps the louré, the soft inégalité, identical with the 2 and 2 printed grouping? I'm not sure at all, because louré is usually said it's a kind of inégalité, so across the beat, but then in a very gentle way. And there are other dark spots, for instance, in French music. For instance, if there is a slur of, say, a group of adjacent notes, and there are 3 notes, the first 3 under a slur, and the 4th is detached, sort of. Does one play inégale or not? I never have seen it explained. Neither that you should not do inégalité, or neither that they say you should play inégale. So grouping of more than 2 notes together, does it exclude inégalité? I don't know. Only a German writer, Quantz, for instance, seems to have been a person saying that as soon as you have more than 2 notes under a slur, you do not play inégale. But I've never read it in France. So this just to say that everybody knows about inégalité, and everybody knows it's a French speciality, and everybody plays inégale, and right, very right to do so. There are still many, many dark spots in it.
The confusion, of course, is a semantic one in that the slur was used to mean so many things.
Yes.
An unequal rhythm in both directions, because certainly in English music, the slur on 2 notes in Purcell more often than not means Lombardic rhythm.
Yes,
as it does in Bach.
Convinced, but whether that's the case in France, I'm not sure at all.
It probably is a sign that Couperin felt the same difficulty, that he devises signs for more things than he actually utilizes in the end. Almost the problem is that in France they wrote too much and devised too much explanation for their style, as opposed to Italy where they wrote too little and gave signs of too little.
Yes. Yeah, and essential things they did not touch, strangely enough.
Would this be because
I would say about half of the music, say, or only of François Couperin, I don't know what he means in the rhythmical sense. And that's a lot.
It's nice to hear an admission, because I'm sure a lot of very willing performers are paralyzed by a feeling that nowadays authenticity has acquired a mystique, which implies that the people who play according to authentic rules have solved all the problems. And as you already said, in performance one certainly has to give primarily conviction to what one's doing.
Oh yes.
Which doesn't rule out, I think, the possibility of, after every performance, admitting that one may be uncertain as to the chapter and verse that proves one's point.
Exactly.
How long do you think that's the implied system of consciousness of strong beats and weak beats, like good fingers and bad fingers, exists? It's not limited, of course, to Bach and pre-Bach, but should it continue right through classical music?
Oh, I'm sure. And I believe it went on well into the 19th century. I haven't studied it so much, but what I gathered, that, well, there were old-fashioned schools and modern schools, that it went on quite long. And reading the memoirs of Spoor, for instance, that's revealing in this respect, showing how he gradually wants to get away of the distinction between good and bad, and the long tone was what he wanted. But still, I'm not sure that his long tone was the same long tone as of a modern famous violinist. For them it was a novel thing, but when they describe then something, they may have exaggerated its effect, and for us it may still seem very much closer to the Baroque than our very, very, very constant holding of tones.
We don't realize sometimes, I think, what an exaggerated age we live in that this assumption of an absolutely uniform tone throughout every stroke of a violin is to us very normal. I think to most other generations almost would have been abnormal.
Oh, yes.
And often very unmusical.
Yes.
One area I think that we sometimes forget nowadays when discussing original sources is that we think in terms of solo music or large ensemble music, forgetting that the keyboard player was in more cases than not employed as an accompanist, either to a group or a soloist. There are many instructions, many contradictory instructions, and far too many basic texts, of course, on how to interpret figuring into chords. Good taste, obviously, has to operate a great deal in the art of accompaniment, but are there any areas where you think we've departed from 18th century taste in this matter?
Well, I think yes, but that's my personal musical judgment, because nothing is so individual as continual playing. As you hinted already, most of the sources we know about playing from figures are extremely uninteresting because they are not really schools for continual playing, but what we call harmony books, and they stop explaining where we would like things to start. That after the explanation of what a sixth chord is, good heavens, we know that, we would like to know in what position you might play it, under certain circumstances, and so forth. But no, there are very, very few valuable schools. And from those we can see how refined the playing was and how much thought was given to the piece as a whole. So to what the soloists or soloists are doing. And I believe that's the essential thing of accompanying. You do not actually play your figures. The figures help you knowing what the harmonic background is. And then you listen to what happens, or you see it in your score, and you become a part of the piece of music. And especially in dynamic sense, the accompanist has a very important role to play, because he can spoil everything by being too loud at a delicate moment, just playing the chord which he sees in its figure, or that he does not help a strong accent with a strong, heavy, furious chord. So again, like everything in music, it's the imagination of the whole which is needed, in this case, in order to play a fine continuo.
Two specific problems are noticeable, I think, that most modern players evade. One is that in the few examples we have of continuo parts written out as they were suggested to be played, the solo line or the vocal line is nearly always doubled at the top of the accompaniment, which is something that I think a modern accompanist would find slightly tasteless, that you should stay below the voice and not double its part.
Yes, and the latter remark you find in many, I think, good schools, and so often written out continuos were written out for stupid people. And who writes out for stupid people? Stupid men, I think. So
possibly also written out for slightly uncertain soloists.
Yes,
who
help
need a little
to
help.
Get the picture. So I would not take them as a fine example. Telemanns Generalbassübungen, that's absolutely dreadful. If you play that, you spoil the whole music. But that's the the easiest way for a beginner to start to learn to hit the right chords.
It's been reprinted so much, I'm
yes.
sure it's regarded as a standard text.
It's awful.
Which texts would you recommend in its place for an aspiring continuo player to study?
Well, Gasparini, for instance, is very detailed. Penna, so a whole group of authors of the late 17th century. And then the best and most detailed school is again of our already so often mentioned C.P.E. Bach.
One of the things that people evade is the fact that Italian writers seem to indicate enormously thick chords, both left hand and right hand, full of notes and with plenty of acciacchaturas and passing notes.
Well, that's for probably big places where the harpsichord should make the maximum of noise to be heard, and also at moments when the action on the scene is not one of the most delicate. So the part writing of that accompanist is not important anymore at all. It's just a splash of sound, or for instance, something like that. It's difficult to make more noise on a harpsichord.
It would also be nice, though, if such a style were employed nowadays occasionally when drama was needed.
Oh, yes.
In place of the over-popular style of practicing one's scales up and down the keyboard.
Yes.
To give
yes,
excitement,
yes.
which was never, as far as I've ever seen, a recommended style of continuo playing.
No, certainly not.
Do you think, though, that descriptions of performing styles and performers have to be taken with a pinch of salt? Because most people will offer you these very vivid descriptions of Corelli playing the violin with his eyes rolling, and Carl Philipp playing the clavichord, and I think the nice phrase of Berne's that drops of effervescence distilled from his countenance. That he got very excited and felt that, and said in fact, that no performer can hope to move an audience unless he himself is moved, which seems very much contrary to the view of Couperin, that you should be equable and look calm and not make faces at the keyboard.
Yeah, well, then you bring in the important differentiation between the nations. I think the French never liked excesses and never liked to show whether something was difficult or not, and it was more a social affair. And the Germans, eccentric as they were, I should say, they were quite different in that respect. But how far that should be taken literal, and how far we would get the same impression of C.P.E. Bach playing or Corelli, I'm not sure. Perhaps we would be less impressed.
C.P.E. surprises us on the page, I think, so often with what for its time appeared to be very extreme markings of dynamics, sudden fortissimos and pianissimos. Mm-hmm. And I suppose to the modern ear, used to a very large volume when fortissimo is mentioned, or a very small volume when pianissimo, the thought of all these dynamic scales reduced to the variety that the clavichord is capable of.
Yes.
Does, in fact, this application of expressive principles mean that he is merely trying to extract the maximum from a small instrument?
Yes, I'm sure. But then on that instrument, everybody knows its limit. It would really sound like fortissimo against pianissimo. One immediately adjusts oneself to that level, and one lives in enormous worlds.
When you come across the same styles as that recommended in larger orchestral works, which follow the same dynamic patterns, the same, I think, as the illustrations that Quantz gives for the embellishing of a melody, not only with additional notes, but with,
with the
apparently very
dynamic
extreme
markings.
dynamic markings where the appoggiatura is very stressed and the resolution very much diminuendo. Are they to be taken as merely reflections of a tendency, or as literal, very loud to very soft?
Well, in the case of Quantz, I think he exaggerated a little, because so detailed playing with so big contrast is a bit outrageous, I think. But on the other hand, dynamic markings in, for instance, C.P.E. Bach symphonies for strings, I can imagine well to be taken literal, that really, when there's fortissimo, that the strings play as loud as they can. I think that's part of this highly, highly intense music, which is totally different from the grace of Quantz.
It also agrees in that case with the fact that he marks certain very coherent passages with a variety of dynamic marks. They begin with a bar of fortissimo, then they drop to forte, then they come to a mezzo forte, then back to fortissimo. So the gradations at least are real, and
oh, yeah, I'm sure, yes.
There's no reason to believe that one wasn't going up to the maximum volume of the instrument.
I think early music, for some people, still means that you have to restrain yourself. I don't believe a thing about that. Perhaps for French music, but that's more in the French vein altogether, that they didn't like extremes. But why not in other music take the maximum if the maximum evidently is there? And why not play as loud as you can if it is required? Only because it's early, you shouldn't restrain yourself. I can't see that point.
It's the same as the outrageous theory that because it's old music it should be played slowly.
Yes.
That nothing must go too fast.
Yes.
Do you think, though, a natural restraint is put on people by the authenticity of the instrument that they perform on?
Well, perhaps it happens sometimes, but why, again, shouldn't a good player go beyond limits if necessary? Because an instrument is only an instrument, and one has a musical imagination, which was made finally after, well, years of living with that and reading and playing. And then that we want to bring to life on an instrument. So the instrument must serve our imagination. It's a dangerous thing to say, because we must also learn from an instrument these days. But then when we play, the instrument is only an instrument. So the limits may be touched and even sometimes gone beyond. Yeah, surpassed.
finale of C.P.E. Bach's double concerto in E-flat, played by Annika Uitenbos, harpsichord, and Jean Antonietti, fortepiano, with the Leonhardt Consort and the Vienna Concertus Musicus, conducted by Gustav Leonhardt. It ends the last program in our series, The Complete Music Master, in which Christopher Hogwood was talking with Gustav Leonhardt. The whole series was devised and produced by Clive Bennett.